I'm just recording. Okay. And I'm going to be sharing screen now. There we go. Right. Let me just enlarge this map.
The meeting started.
Right. So there's a lot of ground to cover today, ladies and gentlemen. And before we talk about the current standoff in Eastern Ladakh, it's very important to understand the historical factors of this line of actual control and how we got here. Without understanding history, without understanding context, we will not be able to come to a proper analysis of why China is doing what it's doing. So for the first 5 to 7 minutes, I thought I would briefly summarize the history of the line of actual control. Now, what is the line of actual control? Whenever we've read about Chinese transgressions or Chinese intrusions, what's constantly put out is that there are differing perceptions of the line of actual control. There is a Chinese claim line, an Indian claim line, that the boundary is undemarcated, that it's not been mapped or drawn up. What does this mean? So let's dive into that first. The line of actual control, or the border between India and China, is not a question of 2 lines, but a question of 5 lines. So let's look at these 5 lines very quickly. And for that, I understand this map is a little complex to look at. I will make it as simple as possible, and I will make it as fun as possible, and as easy as possible to follow. So let's take a trip back to 1865. Now, in 1865, an Englishman named William Johnson was the chief surveyor of the India's external boundaries. He was given the mandate to draw India's external boundaries with neighbors. Now, he was a bit of an opportunist, and he was angling for a very powerful position in the Dogra Empire, the Dogra court. So what he did was...
Excuse me, Mr. Tanvir, I have to request everybody to mute themselves because I can hear a lot of background noises.
Yes, I'll hold.
Participants, please mute yourself, whoever is unmuted. Somebody has joined with Galaxy J7 that is not muted.
Friends, I don't know why they're not understanding.
Shobha, why can't the host mute everybody? Can that not?
Yeah, I think I made Tanvir host. So Tanvir, can you make everybody mute?
Muted yourself.
1 minute. I'm trying to figure out how to do this myself. Participants, mute all. Yes, I'm just going to mute everybody.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Perfect. Everybody's been muted now. So I'm going back to the discussion. If I'm not audible, somebody please send a message. So what do I? Yes. It's good. Right. Let me go back to the map. Yes. So as I said, in 1865, an enterprising Englishman named William Johnson was given the role to map India's external boundaries. And he was trying very hard to court favor in the Dogra court. So to please the Dogra king, he drew, and if you follow my mouse here, this line, which was called the Johnson line. Now, the Johnson line is the political border to which India draws its current maps. It is the current map or the current line on which India claims its boundary with China, as you can see very clearly, encompassing all of Aksai Chin. Now, this was in 1865. Now, in 1873, the British Foreign Office said, hey, wait a minute, Mr. Johnson. I think you've done a little too much to please the Dogra Empire. We cannot in good conscience accept a line that far. The Dogra Empire's claims never stretched that far. So we're going to draw another line. So what the British Foreign Office did in 1873 was draw this line here, this yellow line called the Foreign Office line. Now, bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that in that time, Britain and Russia were in competition with each other. It was the great geopolitical game in Afghanistan, in the Himalayas, and both of these countries were trying to woo China very aggressively. Both of these countries were trying to court China. So when Britain presented the Johnson line to China in 1873, China said, okay, we accept the Johnson line. But China accepted this line from a position of weakness because China at the time was ruled by a very weak Qing government, and they were putting down rebellions in and around that area. So they had really no ability to enforce any of their claims. Now, in 1893, what happened was the Chinese came back and said, look, this alignment, this Johnson line, we don't accept it. It takes up too much territory in the Aksai Chin. You need to redraw the map. And what then happened is that Britain decided, look, we have to court the Chinese. We have to, appease the Chinese, and we have to do this to check Russian expansionism. So what happened in 1895? George Mccartney, who was British envoy to the Kashgar, and Sir Claude MacDonald, who was the British envoy to Peking, used the 1873 Foreign Office line to draw up another line, this green line here. And this green line was named the Macaulay-Mccartney line. So you have the Johnson line encompassing all of the Aksai Chin, and you have this new Macaulay-Mccartney line and the Foreign Office line drawn up by these two diplomats because they really wanted to appease China and they wanted to give some inhospitable land to China. At that time, very interestingly, there was a complete rift between the British Foreign Office and the Director of Military Affairs, headed by John Ardegh. John Ardegh said, hey, wait a minute, how can you give away so much land to China? Why are you drawing this Macaulay-Mccartney line? He went back to the Johnson line, modified it a little bit, redrew it, and that became the Johnson-Ardegh line. So now we've got from 3 lines, we've got 2 lines, the Johnson-Ardegh line and the Macaulay-Mccartney line. But ultimately, the diplomats prevailed, the Foreign Office prevailed, and the British government submitted the new maps with the Macaulay-Mccartney line to the Chinese government that said, hey, look, we are conscious of the fact that you need territory. So we are giving you all of this territory here. And this is going to be the new de facto border between India and China. And here is where it gets interesting. Here is where the twist is. The Qing government took the maps and did nothing. They did not accept the map. They did not reject the map. And they did not ratify the new alignment, which means there was now a sort of border limbo. Nobody knew if the border was at the Johnson-Ardegh line. Nobody knew if the border was at the Mccartney line. And it was just left in absolute and total limbo. And as a result of that, the British government completely forgot about the Mccartney-Macaulay line and the Foreign Office line. And everybody went back to pretending that the Johnson-Ardegh line was the de facto border between India and China. In 1911, the Qing government collapsed. There was rebellion and China went into civil war. Now, fast forward to 1959. Up to 1959, both sides, India and China, respected the Johnson-Ardegh line. In fact, you see these points here, Karatak Pass and Haji Langar. Indian soldiers were actually making patrols in the Aksai Chin up to these points. Now, in 1959 or in 1957, China under Mao built a road connecting the Xinjiang region of China to Tibet. And they built this road through the Aksai Chin. They built this road through the axis here. They built this road in 1956, which India found out only in 1957. And that's where the border problem started flaring up. And then, surprisingly, in 1960, what the Chinese did was they went back and presented new maps to India. And in these new maps, they refused the Johnson-Ardegh line. They pretended that the Macaulay-Mccartney line did not exist. And they drew the border here, which is the 1960 claim line, which is the claim line that China is now trying to go back to today. India, of course, rejected this 1960 claim line and said, no, how can you present to us this claim line out of nowhere? You have to respect the Johnson-Ardegh line that was drawn up in 1865. So you can see there's a huge differential. And in 1962, what happened was India and China went to war. It was a brief border war in October and November of 1962. It ended up in a humiliating defeat. And then, as a consequence of that, this line was born, this little blue line here, which has now become the line of actual control. This is the line of actual control that both parties now adhere to. This has now become the de facto border. In the last 50 years, there has been no attempt to ratify the line, to demarcate it, to draw it. Absolutely nothing. And we'll go into why that happens. What is China trying to do now in Eastern Ladakh? It is trying now to move back to the 1960 claim line that it occupied when it was victorious in the 1962 war. It's trying to reassert its boundaries to this claim line. Whereas India is saying, no, 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 this is the temporary line of control, but we claim all of this as part of the Aksai Chin. So now we have the history of the 5 lines of actual control. With that history, let's now move into what happened in Eastern Ladakh. Now, on the 5th of May, 2020, clashes broke out here at the Pangong Tso Lake area between Indian and Chinese soldiers, as well as the Nakula border sector in Sikkim. Immediately after these clashes, the Chinese 362nd and 363rd Border Regiment, based out of Xinjiang, reinforced with the 6th Infantry Mechanized Division, occupied the Galwan Heights, occupied the hot springs, occupied the finger areas between 8 and 4, and I will go into the Pangong Tso subsequently, and brought in their significant amount of troops, tanks, heavy artillery in their rear bases, and brought them from their rear bases to their forward bases, ending up in a standoff. Now, why did they do this? What were the reasons for this sudden occupation? There are a multitude of factors. Let's look at it tactically, and then we will look at it strategically. The first factor is tactical. Obviously, over the last few years, India has put a lot of priority on border road infrastructure. It's in the process of completing over 70 border roads and tunnels across the line of actual control from Eastern Ladakh all the way to Arunachal Pradesh, and significant progress has been made, which allows India to move troops and logistics and material faster to these border areas from, in fact, 16 days to 1 day. So that was obviously something that rattled them. Second was, of course, the abrogation of Article 370 and declaring Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh to be 2 union territories. And bear in mind, this is what India did with NIFA in Northeastern Frontier Province. They sort of converted it into Arunachal Pradesh. So obviously China was rattled by this internal abrogation, thinking that, you know, they have now converted it into 2 union territories, and now they're going to lay claim to the entire Aksai Chin. So they were obviously rattled and intimidated by that. So there was, again, the construction of border roads, and 2, there was the abrogation of 370. And these are the 2 tactical reasons. As for the strategic reasons, we will move on to that now. Now let's look at the Galwan Valley itself, because again, it's the site of the clash that on 15th of June claimed the life of 20 Indian soldiers. Why is the Galwan Valley strategically important? If you look here, we have the Siachen Glacier. The Siachen Glacier is the highest battlefield in the world. India dominates the Siachen Glacier with about controlling 2/3 of the glacier, including the Saltoro Ridge, gives it a huge tactical opportunity over Pakistan. By taking the Galwan Valley, what China wants to do is cut off India's access to be able to reinforce the Siachen Glacier. Once you hold the Galwan Valley, you make it difficult to supply the Siachen Glacier, making India's claim on the Siachen Glacier untenable. So there is a lot of occupation of the Galwan Valley at the behest of Pakistan as well. There's obviously a lot of cooperation between these 2 countries, but it goes deeper. Now, before we go into the strategic reasons as to why they have sort of started this standoff and these intrusions, let us look at their positions along the border. Now, these satellite images were taken prior to the Galwan clash, or maybe around the time of the Galwan clash, and you can see here a Chinese buildup at the Galwan River Valley. You can see a buildup at the hot springs, and you can see a buildup at the Pangong Tso. Now we'll get to the Pangong Tso in a minute, but it's very important to maintain very clearly that the Chinese, buildup along the Galwan River Valley and along the hot springs was not deep into Indian territory, but was on the line of control, on the actual line of control. And it's also important to understand that in the hot springs area and the Gogra area, the Chinese claim line and the line of actual control actually meet. Now, why did they do this? Why have they occupied the Galwan Valley, and why have they occupied the hot springs? And why are they occupying the Pangong Tso? It is because they are rattled by this. I present to you the Daulat Beg Oldie Shiok Dabruk Road. The Daulat Beg Oldie Shiok Dabruk Road connects Leh all the way to Daulat Beg Oldie, which means that it runs along the line of actual control, and it allows the Indian army to move troops and material very quickly from Leh along the line of actual control to fortified positions. So what they have done is, by positioning themselves in the Galwan Valley, by positioning themselves in the hot springs and Gogra area, they have the ability to shell this road, to choke off this road and cut off this road, rendering it useless in a time of war. Why are they doing this? They are doing this ultimately because of the Daulat Beg Oldi. Now, nobody talks about the Daulat Beg Oldi. And how we know that the ultimate goal is the Daulat Beg Oldi is because of the Depsang Plains. Now, bear in mind, everybody has been talking about the Galwan, everybody has been talking about the Pangong So, everybody has been talking about the hot springs, but nobody has been talking about the Depsang Plains. Now, the Depsang Plains was subject to an intrusion in 2013, where both sides built up and ultimately the Chinese side pulled back. But it's very important to understand, looking at this map, that China's idea or goal is to put pressure across the DBO road, at the hot springs, at the Gogra, at the Depsang Plains. Because if the Chinese control the Depsang Plains, and if they're able to control the approach from Leh, they will be able to cut off the Daulat Beg Oldi. Now, what is the Daulat Beg Oldi? The Daulat Beg Oldi is simply an airstrip. It's one of the highest airstrips and landing grounds in the world. It was activated during the UPA regime. The Air Force activated it without informing the government that they were activating it. But what is so strategically significant? The Daulat Beg Oldi overlooks the Karakoram Pass. Now, the Karakoram Highway is what connects China and Pakistan. Bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that as part of the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor, China has invested close to $60 billion in infrastructure development in the CPEC. So what terrifies the Chinese is that now the Indian military has the ability, it's built a road from Leh all the way up to the Daulat Beg Oldi, which means that in a time of war, they will not have to struggle to reinforce Daulat Beg Oldi. They will not have to struggle to bring in men and material. And Daulat Beg Oldi can actually be used as a military base to shell the Karakoram Pass, to destroy the Karakoram Highway, effectively severing China's only land link between China and Pakistan. So obviously this scares them a lot. So the ultimate pressure is to put so much pressure onto India. And let me go back up to the claim line here, is to redraw the map, cut off the Galwan Valley, create more of a buffer between the Aksai Chin and the border at Ladakh, in order to occupy or cut off India from the Daulat Beg Oldi, securing China's Karakoram Highway between China and Pakistan, protecting the China-Pakistan economic corridor. That is the game. It is not the Galwan, it is not the Pangong So, it is not the hot springs, it is not the Gogra, it is not even the Depsang Plains, which for some reason nobody is talking about. It is the Daulat Beg Oldi airstrip. That is the ultimate prize. Because if you control Daulat Beg Oldi, you have effectively cut off the Siachen and you have cut off India's only overlook on the Karakoram, providing a huge geostrategic opportunity to China and Pakistan. Now, before we go into why China is doing this and why it's trying to protect its wanted China-Pakistan economic corridor, it's only fair to touch on the what China is doing in the Pangong So. Now, this is the Pangong So Lake. The Pangong So Lake, if you see, is divided into spurs or fingers, right? There are 8 fingers. Now, India claims that its territory or the line of actual control ends at finger 8. The Chinese claim line says that China's border is at finger 2. So there is this gray area between finger 2 and finger 8. Now, India and China have gone through 5 rounds of border agreements in 93, in 96, in 2005, in 2013. As part of these border agreements, they said, look, both sides will not carry weapons. And more importantly, in disputed areas or in these gray areas, nobody will build any sort of temporary or permanent structures. In 1999, when India went to war with Kargil, they actually pulled troops from the Finger 4 area and sent it to Kargil. So what the Chinese did in 1999, that while India was fighting Pakistan in Kargil, they built a road here on Finger 4. When Indian soldiers found that they had built a road, they found another axis to patrol past the road on Finger 4 all the way up to finger 8. So what was happening up till 2020 is that Chinese patrols would come all the way to finger 2, Indian soldiers would patrol all the way to finger 8, and there was an understanding. India traditionally has strong military bases in the finger 2, finger 3 area. And China, as per its border agreement, has not, up to 2020, built any kind of temporary or permanent structure between 2 and 8. The most egregious violation of what we believe to be the line of actual control is China actually constructing hundreds of permanent and temporary structures, bunkers, machine gun nests, pillboxes, radar stations, observation posts, and concrete structures between the finger 4 and finger 8 areas. Now, while there's been a lot of talk about disengagement, while there's been a lot of talk of de-escalation, it's important to understand what the differences between de-escalation and disengagement is. De-escalation is when you have troops staring eyeball to eyeball, right? So the first stage of de-escalation is where the troops who are staring eyeball to eyeball go back 2 kilometers on either side, creating a temporary buffer. And disengagement is when you start moving your tanks, your artillery, your troop buildup, your heavy weapons, your fighter jets back from their forward bases to their rear bases. Now, after the call between Wang Yi and Ajit Doval on the 5th of July, China has disengaged from the Galwan. China has disengaged from the hot springs area, but it has not disengaged from the Gogra area. It has not disengaged from the Depsang Bulge. And it has certainly not disengaged from the Pangong Tso area. In fact, what it's done, it has nominally pulled some of its troops from the finger 4 ridge lines here, but it continues to occupy the finger 4 area all the way up to finger 8. So there is absolutely no change in status quo on the ground between the fingers 4 and 8, as well as no change on the ground in the Gogra area and the Depsang Plains. What does this mean? It means that this conflict is not going to resolve itself anytime soon. This conflict is not going to end in the next few weeks. The Indian army typically pulls back from patrolling in the harsh Ladakhi winters because of the snows. Has now said, look, we have to now dig in for the winter. So they're now ordering cold weather tents. They're ordering kerosene oil, antifreeze oil. They're ordering extra rations. And they are now beginning to dig in for the long haul because they expect this standoff to go in as late as October or November. So obviously we are now at a détente, as they would say. China has very clearly violated all of its border agreements by constructing these permanent positions in the gray area or in the neutral zone, as it is also done in the Depsang Plains, which is, again, I'm surprised why nobody is talking about it more. There are no satellite images. Nobody is able to tell us what the buildup is, whether they've occupied the bottleneck, whether they've not occupied the bottleneck. So that's a huge question mark. Despite this, I continue to maintain that the Pangong Tso is not as geostrategically important as the Daulat Beg Oldie, but it's important to give you context as to how brazenly China has violated every agreement, border agreement that it has signed with India. Now, strategically, why is China doing this? Now, this is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. If you can see here, China has spent billions of dollars upgrading the Gaudat port to a deep water port. It is building rail lines and road lines connecting Gaudat and Karachi all the way up to Kashgar in China. Why is it doing this? It's doing this to secure an energy source or energy supply route. And in the next map, it will become abundantly clear why this piece of barren, inhospitable land in Eastern Ladakh is so valuable. There's been a lot of talk in the news, which I find laughable. They're saying that Pakistan owes China $37 billion in debt, and Pakistan is going to go broke, and Pakistan is not going to be able to pay back China because it's invested $60 billion building these road and rail. I say it's absolute rubbish. China doesn't care about the money. It doesn't care about the $60 billion. It has invested for the next 100 years a very secure, easy energy route to move its energy from the Middle East. And without further ado, I present to you China's great game and the reason for this Ladakh standoff. And the reason is not land, it is energy. Look at this map. All of the oil production comes from these Middle Eastern OPEC countries, right here. Now, what China needs to do is if it needs to bring oil and energy and trade from the Middle East, it has to take its ships around the Arabian Sea, into the Indian Ocean, across the Straits of Malacca to Shanghai, right here. Now, this is a long journey. This is a journey of 10, 15 days. And most importantly, the Straits of Malacca are a strategic bottleneck for China because, as you can see here, India has naval presence in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So in case of hostilities, the Indian Navy can effectively block off the Straits of Malacca, halting the supply of Chinese trade and supply of Chinese energy over here, preventing it from reaching the mainland. So this is obviously a geostrategic weakness for China. However, this is your China-Pakistan economic corridor. The ports at Gaudar and Karachi. So all that China needs to do now, very simply, is to move its ships from the Middle East here, right to the port of Gaudar, dismantle the oil, dismantle the goods from Gaudar and take it by road and rail to Kashgar. Simple. Less time, less money, more geostrategic security. And in order to protect this energy route, it is important to make sure that India is kept in check, that Indian military infrastructure build-up does not pose a threat to China, does not pose a threat to Pakistan, and that India will not attempt any kind of military misadventurism. Because when Article 370 was abrogated, you had Amit Shah saying that Akshay Chin is an integral part of India, POK is an integral part of India, and we expect to have jurisdiction over it very soon. Now, going back to this map, you see a lot of the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor actually going right through the Gilgit-Baltistan, which India claims as its own. So what China is afraid is that if India went to war with Pakistan, they would try to recapture the Gilgit-Baltistan area, effectively cutting off the economic corridor, cutting off the energy route, and cutting off the supplies. So China is terrified that India would move to choke off its energy routes, which is why it has now started this military adventure in the high Himalayas, especially when India is grappling with COVID, when the world is grappling with COVID, thinking that India will come from a position of weakness. And what China has done to cement this transfer of what do you say, energy to the Gaudar is, if I go back here, right here is Djibouti. This country here is Djibouti. Now, Djibouti has a GDP of $1.7 billion. Just to put that in context, Mukesh Ambani made $20 billion last month. But Djibouti's entire GDP is $1.7 billion. Djibouti owes 80%, that's 80% of its debt, of its GDP debt to China because of infrastructure projects. Obviously, they couldn't pay. So China said, look, don't pay us. Let us build a military base in Djibouti. And voila presto, the Chinese have constructed a military base here, right here, very close to the American Camp Lemonnier, from which America flies drones against Al-Shabaab terrorists in Somalia. They've created this military base here, this Sentinel base that oversees the shipping passing through the Red Sea, through the Strait of Hormuz, to the Bab al-Mandeb, so that they can keep an eye on their ships until it reaches Karachi and Gaudar, thereby very carefully securing their energy routes. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the great game. Not the Galwan Valley, not the Pangong Tso. It is the Daulat Beg Oldi overseeing the South Karakoram, and it is to protect the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Now, the next question, can they do it? Do they have the military strength to pull it off? And to understand that, let us look at some of these forced dispositions of India and China. Now, in 2016, what China did was that it basically had a huge overhaul of its military structuring and divided its army or its military into 5 theater commands. Now, a theater command is basically when you bring army, air force, and naval assets under one theater commander. So they had the Western Theater Command, Eastern Theater Command, Southern Theater Command, etc., etc. Now, the Western Theater Command, which is headed by a very hawkish general named Zheng Jiuli, is in charge of operations against India. The Western Theater Command, and I'll go into the military aspects of it very briefly because it's important to understand the troop disposition. The Western Theater Command is home to the 76th and 77th Army Group, which is located at Chongqing and Baoji. Now, the 76th and 77th Army Group comprises of about 120,000 soldiers. And under the Western Theater Command, you have the Tibet Military District, which has about 40,000 soldiers that have been placed there to put down rebellions and insurrections, and another 70,000 soldiers in the Xinjiang Military District. So if you combine the 76th and 77th Army groups, the Tibet Military District Army and the Xinjiang Military District Army, you have about 225 to 230,000 PLA troops that are targeted towards India. On the Indian side, operations against the Chinese fall to three army commands. One is the Northern Army Command, based in Udhampur, which oversees operations in Kashmir and Ladakh. You have the Central Army Command, which is based in Uttar Pradesh, Lucknow and Uttar Pradesh. And you have the Eastern Army Command, which is in Bengal. These three army commands command around 225,000 soldiers, whose sole purpose is to counter China. So from a troop standpoint, from a man-to-man standpoint, you have equal number of Chinese troops and you have equal number of Indian troops. So it's not as if India has a numerical inferiority. They have a numerical, I would say, it's comparably equal. What goes in Indian advantage is that India has some of the best mountaineering troops in the world. It has sort of really pioneered and championed mountaineering combat. It has a lot of experience in Siachen Glacier. It has a lot of experience in high altitude warfare, and is trying very hard to catch up in terms of inducting the kind of equipment used to fight a mountain war, whether it's light howitzers to light tanks to drones. It's in the process of trying to bridge this gap to create a truly capable mountain strike force to be able to give an offensive punch into China. So it's not as if it was 1962 where, you know, the Indian army was unprepared, it was too stretched. The Chinese can just simply walk over into India. Certainly, if there was a war now, it would be a very tough fight and it would end up with China getting a bloody nose. So this is precisely why they have chosen not to escalate. This is why they have chosen not to push their claims of violence, because they understand now that the ground reality does not allow for a very easy, comprehensive victory that they had in 1962. The other important aspect to look at is the Air Force. And it's important to understand that while, and there's been a lot of talk about the Air Force in the news. Yes, China enjoys a superiority in aircraft. It has the 4.5 generation J-20. It's developing the 5th generation Shenyang 31 fighter jet. But understand that the Chinese air bases that are located in Tibet are located at altitudes. And because they're located at altitudes, there is a factor called MTOW, or maximum take-off weight. As a consequence of that, Chinese jets, however superior, when taking off from these altitude bases, have to cut fuel by half and have to cut the actual armaments that they are carrying by half, because they don't have the ability to carry a full load and a full weight of fuel, which means that they would need more jets flying longer sorties to be able to have some kind of superiority against India vis-a-vis Air Force planes. What China desperately needs, and it doesn't have yet, are air-to-air refueling tankers. That's very important, because these air-to-air refueling tankers will allow jets to fuel mid-air and continue their sortie. So which is why China needs to have more jets, even though they have superiorly better jets, in order to maintain an edge vis-a-vis India. Now, Indian air bases are structured very, very differently. Indian air bases are at the ground level. They don't have restrictions of MTOW. And they have been structured in such a way that, see, again, these Chinese air bases are actually spread out very far from each other in Tibet, in the Tibet Autonomous or the Tibet region, which means if one air base is attacked, another air base cannot come to the aid of that air base. But Indian air bases are structured at Hashimara and Baddogra in such a way that if one air base is attacked, planes from another Indian air base will come to support that air base. Indian Air Force has actually worked very hard in terms of creating redundant command and control systems. It has hardened bunkers. It has moved its command and control underground. And it has worked very hard over the last 2-3 decades to survive a Chinese first strike. So if China, say, attacks Indian air bases with jets, with missiles, the Indian Air Base has the ability to repave a runway within 6 hours. It's actually in the process of acquiring fiberglass runways, so that, you know, the runways can be now replaced in about a matter of few hours, and jets can be flying again. So what the Indian Air Force has done is it's worked very hard to ensure that no Air Force base is completely taken out of circulation if attacked by Chinese fighters or Chinese missiles. And this is important because China has a huge numerical superiority in missiles. It has about 1,500 to anywhere between 2,500 ballistic missiles pointed against India and Indian armed installations and air bases. In fact, when the Doklam standoff happened, a lot of Indian military planners were surprised that they didn't use these missiles. But the Indian Air Force, what is done, it's calculated that the Chinese would need an approximate of 200 to 250 ballistic missiles per air base per day to render an Indian Air Force base useless. So at best, given their inventory of about 1,500 to 2,000 missiles, at best they can put out maybe 2 or 3 bases out of commission for about 2 days. So it's not as if with one massive, air assault, or with one massive missile assault, they will completely wipe out all of Indian Air Force bases, making it impossible for India to retaliate. So India has worked very hard to sort of ensure the survivability of its air bases to be able to make a very powerful counterpunch. Now, yes, there is certainly a huge capability gap between the Indian Armed Forces and the Chinese Armed Forces. There is, the Indian Air Force has struggled with aircraft shortages. It's not inducting in time. There have been serious delays in inducting 4th generation platforms. We just have the first 5 Rafales landing in India in July. India has a long way to go. So there is certainly an Air Force gap. Very important to know, there is certainly a drone gap because China uses armed drones, which it uses to sort of patrol the line of actual control. India uses Israeli suicide drones. So there is a sort of a drone advantage that China has. And even on the ground, China has several advantages in terms of mobile artillery, in terms of light tanks that can operate better in the Himalayan regions, in terms of other mechanized equipment. But despite these sort of advantages in equipment and despite the superiority in aircraft, understand that there is a ratio. In the Himalayas, at an altitude, when you are trying to push an enemy away from his defended positions, your ratio of defender to attacker is 1:6. That is, for every 1 defender, you need 6 attackers. In 1962, the 4th Corps under General Call comprised of 12,000 Indian soldiers. The Chinese sent 80,000 soldiers. So there was very clearly that 1:6 ratio, which allowed them to sort of push the Indians back in 1962. This 1:6 ratio does not exist today, which means that despite having your conventional superiority in arms and armaments, you would still need an additional number of Chinese divisions, to assist your existing, Chinese soldiers in the Western Theater Command to actually forcefully alter the line of control by military means. Which is why the PLA has now understood that fighting a border war would be inconclusive. It would lead to a large loss of life on either side, and it would not create the territorial gains that the Chinese are looking for. And it is not, I wouldn't say highly unlikely, but it is very difficult to militarily push India back to the 1960 claim line. So from a military standpoint, India is a lot better than what is said in the news, than a lot of what the pundits are saying. And that is because of a systematic infrastructure upgrade, induction of new weapons platforms, and sort of generally a lot of aggressive China planning over the last, 10, 15, 20 years. So it's not going to be a cakewalk. It's not going to be a jujube, which makes armed conflict all the more unlikely. Again, when will this conflict end? No one knows, because at this point, China is holding all the cards. It has no reason to disengage. It has no reason to give up its, strategic posts in the Spangong and the Dep Song. It wants to be able to overlook the DBO road. It wants to be able to shell it at a moment's notice. India does not have much to bring to the bargaining table. So it's going to be a very long, drawn-out, protracted negotiation. And only time will tell what kind of diplomatic and political pressure that India can bring on China to sort of get them to disengage. And we have got them to disengage before. We've got them to disengage in Chumar in 2013, again in 2014, in the Doklam in 2017. So there is a strong possibility of disengagement. But again, understand that this disengagement is not going to come about with talks between Harinder Singh, who's the corps commander of the Leh 4 Corps, and Lin Liu, who's this Chinese counterpart. it's good to have these two armies talking for 14 hours, 16 hours, but ultimately it has to be political. Ultimately, it has to be Ajit Doval talking to Wang Yi. It has to be Modi talking to Xi. It has to be brokered at the political level. And right now, there's only been maybe two conversations between Doval and Wang Yi. And this disengagement will only truly take place once the political diplomatic establishments from both sides get involved. So until then, brace yourselves, prepare for a long haul. This is not going to go anywhere anytime soon, and this is going to continue indefinitely, possibly through the winter, possibly even unto 2021. And that, in a nutshell, is the India-China standoff. Now, is this the only thing that China is doing? Is this the only sort of provocative action that China is doing? No, absolutely not. It has provoked its neighbors in the South China Sea. It continues to needle Taiwan. It continues to, repress in Hong Kong, where it's passed a new Hong Kong, security law. And I thought it would be good to look at what China is doing in the rest of the world and what kind of advantage it's trying to take in this COVID-19 pandemic, and how it's sort of using this COVID-19 pandemic to bolster its maritime and territorial claims. Now, let's talk about Taiwan. Now, before we talk about Taiwan, I want you all to remember this very clearly. If there is one thing that I want you to take away from this conversation, is this: the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is the world's largest manufacturers of semiconductor chips. Semiconductor chips go into everything. They go into your phone, they go into your fridge, they go into your car. If it's electronic, there's a semiconductor in it. If you are talking about the Internet of Things, it runs on semiconductor. If you're talking about artificial intelligence and swarm AI and drone AI and deep learning, it's semiconductors. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is one of the most valuable and most unheard of unicorns in the world. It's far more geostrategically valuable than Apple or Google or Microsoft. And it's important that you read up on this and get to understand this, because a lot of what's happening in Taiwan relates to the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Now, obviously, let's look at what China is doing with Taiwan. China has obviously always claimed Taiwan as a part of its own. And the US has a mutual defense pact with Taiwan that if China invades Taiwan, it will come to its aid. And what has happened is, if you're reading the news, the US has actually sent in 2 aircraft carriers, the USS Nimitz and the USS Theodore Roosevelt, along with their accompanying carrier battle groups, into the Taiwan Straits to conduct into the South China Sea. Why are they doing this? See, up to the 90s, or up to, I would say, the 2000s, the US had a huge conventional military edge over China. So if there was an invasion of China, the US would be able, of Taiwan, the US would be effectively be able to intervene and block that invasion. Over the last 20 years, China has worked very hard to develop very sophisticated ballistic missile technologies. Whether it's Dongfeng 26 carrier killer or the Dongfeng 31D missile, China has actually created anti-access and area denial strategies through the use of thousands and thousands of ballistic missiles that can be used to target American ships, American carriers, American aircraft, to such an extent that today, if there was a conflict with Taiwan and America tried to intervene, there is a very good chance that the Chinese would be able to overwhelm the American intervention force because of its superiority in missiles. Now, why hasn't America caught up? America was actually bound by a treaty with the Russians called the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty said that both America and Russia could not build ballistic missiles. What the Trump administration did was walked away from that treaty and said, hey, no, the world has changed, the geopolitics has changed, we need to be able to build these ballistic missiles. And as a result of that, the US is now trying to catch up very hard in ballistic missile technology development. It's trying to catch up very hard in developing long-range bombers, in F-35 stealth fighters, in order to be able to come to Taiwan's aid without actually bringing its ships within the firing line of China's awesome ballistic missiles. Right? So the US is now working very hard. In fact, the US, which has got bases in Guam, in the second island chain, the US, which has bases in Japan, the US, which has bases in Okinawa, are now in the process of trying to induct both naval and land-based ballistic missiles, and these ballistic missiles are now under development and are being tried out so that they can effectively counter this awesome Chinese wall of ballistic missiles. And obviously this process is going to take about 5 to 10 years, but right now China has this significant superiority in arms and armaments vis-a-vis the US and vis-a-vis Taiwan. So why is the US now sending ships into South China Sea? And we'll get to the South China Sea in a minute. It is because Hawaii, which is a subject of a lot of controversy, which is now being barred from the UK, the US, which is being barred from Italy and Brazil. Hawaii depends very heavily on the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company to supply semiconductor chips. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company has now said that it will no longer be supplying these semiconductor chips to Hawaii, which is problematic because Hawaii depends very heavily on American semiconductor chips and Taiwanese semiconductor chips for its hardware and software equipment. Without these semiconductor chips, they will not be able to develop 5G technologies or 6G technologies, and they will not become the leaders in 5G technology that they want to be. Why America and Taiwan are doing this is because they do not want to make China a leader in 5G technology. America wants to be the leader in 5G technology, which is why it has worked with Taiwan. The TSMC is no longer selling chips to Hawaii, and that is obviously irked off the Chinese. And as a show of strength, the Trump administration is now selling arms to the Taiwanese, and he's routinely sending aircraft carriers and naval ships into the Taiwan Straits, into the South China Sea, to be able to say to China, hey buddy, listen very carefully. I know you're angry, but there's nothing you can do to us because we are America and we have Taiwan's back. So there's obviously a great game being paid out over semiconductor chips. And these little chips are the chips that are going to decide the winner of everything in the future, whether it's wars, whether it's technology, whether it's conductivity. He who controls the semiconductor chips rules the next 100 years. So that is what is basically happening in the Taiwan Straits. Now we move to the South China Sea. This is interesting. Now, the United Nations Convention of the Laws of the Sea say very clearly that from a country's shore, the first 200 nautical miles of sea are its exclusive economic zone. So if you go by the UN clause, these are the economic exclusive zones of Vietnam, of Malaysia, of Brunei, of Philippines. China does not believe in the United Nations Convention of Laws of the Sea. This is what is called the China's 9-dash line. This is China saying, look, all of this sea within the 9-dash line belongs to us. All of the resources in the line, whether it's oil deposits, natural gas deposits, rare earth deposits, belong to us. They have competing claims over the Parcels Islands. They have competing claims. And bear in mind that the Spratleys Islands and the Scarborough, or let's look at the Spratleys first. And it's a very complicated, overlapping claims, because you have Malaysia claiming the Spratleys, you have Brunei claiming the Spratleys, you have Philippines claiming the Spratleys, and you have China claiming the Spratleys. You have China claiming the Scarborough Shoal, you have Philippines claiming the Scarborough Shoal, you have China claiming the parcels, you have Vietnam claiming the parcels. So there's a lot of overlapping, over-competing claims. But what has happened, very interestingly, over the last few days, is that the United States of America has effectively gone and said, look, we reject the 9-dash line. Very important. They have not rejected China's claims over the Spratleys. They have not rejected China's claims over the parcels. They have not rejected China's claims over the Scarborough Shoal, but they have said that we have rejected your claim of the 9-dash line, that all of this is your South China Sea. Until a few days ago, the US was still sending its carriers and its naval ships to conduct these freedom of navigation exercises within the 9-dash line to say, look, you can't intimidate us, you can't bully us. But now for the first time, it has actively come out and said, look, we do not recognize your 9-dash line. You are in violation of the UN Convention Laws of the Sea. You are being a bully in the region. What has China done in the South China Sea? It has now begun to militarize the South China Sea. So what it's done is, within the Spratleys features, it has started actually creating artificial islands. It has actually started dredging, creating deep water harbors, deep water ports, creating runways, creating air bases, building missile silos, housing naval ships, housing air force jets on of these artificial islands in the South China Sea, thereby weaponizing the South China Sea and converting these islands into what are called unsinkable carriers. So instead of actually having to have ships patrol the South China Sea on China's behalf, they have actually illegally occupied these partless features and actually militarized some of them and created naval bases in and around the South China Sea to be able to effectively ward off American ships, or Vietnamese ships, or Malaysian ships, or Philippine ships in times of conflict. And they have accelerated the development of these militarized bases during COVID-19. In fact, even in February and March, when China was going through the COVID and the rest of the world was unaffected, they still continued to weaponize the South China Sea quite aggressively. And it's not just the South China Sea that the China is now flexing its muscles. In the East China Sea, that is the sea between China and Japan, there are the Senkaku Diao Islands. China is not really interested in the islands itself, but with the huge amount of natural gas and oil deposits around the islands. So what they've done is they have laid a claim to these islands. Now, up to a few years ago, these Senkaku Diao Islands were privately owned by Japanese individuals, by Japanese families. So what the Japanese government did was they actually bought off the islands from these private individuals, from these private persons, and nationalized the islands, which pissed off the Chinese no end. So when they did that, the Chinese government said, look, these are our islands. If you have to overfly these islands, you have to let the Chinese, Air Force know that you're overflying these islands. Otherwise, we will shoot you down. So Japan started flying freedom of navigation exercises over these islands. America started flying fighter planes over these islands. They flew bombers over these islands without informing the Chinese, as if to say, look, we are going to fly over these islands. We are going to do what we want over these islands. We are not going to call you and ask you for permission. You can't bully us into intimidation. But in this pandemic, what China has done is it has not stopped or retracted its claims. It is now pushing its claims more aggressively. And it's actually hottening the Cold War that is taking place in the South China Sea and East China Sea. Now, before we go into the Indian Ocean region and the conclusion, let's briefly talk about what China has done in Hong Kong. Last year in March, April, May, the Hong Kong executive tried to push a extradition bill in Parliament, basically saying that Hong Kongers could be extradited to mainland China and tried for crimes. Now, Hong Kong has enjoyed a lot of autonomy from China as per the agreement between the UK and China in 1997 when Hong Kong was ceded over, and said, look, we enjoy our autonomy. You cannot extradite us to the mainland and get tried. So there were these huge amount of protests. And as a result of that, the Hong Kong executive tabled the bill. They said, okay, we're tabling it. But the protests continued because they said, no, we're not interested in you tabling the bill. We want you to tear up the bill. We want you to junk the bill, destroy the bill. And these protests continued well into November, December. And everybody thought, oh, we're going to have a second Tiananmen Square massacre. We're going to have tanks rolling down the streets. We're going to have innocent civilians being killed. And everybody was really preparing themselves for Tiananmen 2.0. What happened was instead in January and February, the COVID-19 pandemic hit. The protesters went into their homes in Hong Kong to self-isolate, and the Chinese government went in towards sort of taking care of its own COVID mess. Once China was able to get a control over what was happening in China vis-a-vis coronavirus, they actually very quietly and sneakily went to the Hong Kong legislature, dragged out the pro-Hong Kong democracy parliamentarians out of the room, and passed a national security law. This security law, which was passed in Hong Kong, was then ratified in Beijing. And this security law basically classified these protests as a form of treason and dissent, punishable by extradition and imprisonment in mainland China. So effectively, what they did not do with tanks, they did by going into the Hong Kong legislature, dragging the pro-democracy legislators out of the room, and actually getting this law passed. What is more telling is not the fact that now Hong Kongers can be taken to the mainland and extradited, But Article 38 of the law says that any non-Chinese citizen who has criticized China, if he or she were to land in Hong Kong or transit through Hong Kong, and if the government has found that they have posted or said something not so very nice about China, they can be arrested in Hong Kong and extradited to the mainland. Put it to you this way, ladies and gentlemen, if the Chinese knew about this talk, and they probably do because I'm using Zoom, if I land in Hong Kong and because I've said some not so nice things about the Chinese, I could be arrested in Hong Kong and extradited to mainland China. By virtue of any of you attending this call and listening to me, could also, upon either landing in Hong Kong or transiting through Hong Kong, be arrested and extradited to mainland China for trial. So, in case you're planning your holidays, I would avoid Cathay Pacific for the foreseeable future. Now, it's very important to understand that as per the agreement between China and the UK, Hong Kong was supposed to become a fully fledged, city of China by 2047. Obviously, China has upped the timeline, and in doing so, by passing this national security law, has effectively made Hong Kong just another city. And the world has reacted to it. Australia, the US, and the UK have now suspended their extradition treaties with Hong Kong. Australia and the UK have now said, if you're a Hong Kong citizen and you want to flee to our countries, we will give you a visa on arrival. And the UK and Australia has also said, look, if you're a Hong Kong citizen living in Australia and UK and you're on a work permit or a student permit and you're afraid to go back, you can just approach us right now and we will give you automatic citizenship. And obviously, this has pissed off the Chinese to no end. So obviously, there is a lot of reaction on the Chinese side. And a lot of democracies, a lot of Western democracies have actually come out against the Chinese moves in Hong Kong, saying that what you've done is patently undemocratic, it violates the agreement that you had with the United Kingdom, and it is simply draconian. But China does not seem to care. It does not seem to bother. It continues with this aggressive expansionist agenda, even in this COVID-19 pandemic, irrespective of international opinion. Now, finally, before we talk about the Chinese geopolitical mindset and real thing, let's look at what China is doing in the Indian Ocean region. And I think the most important takeaway here is what China is doing in the Indian Ocean region. Right. I'm sure you've heard it before, the Chinese pearl necklace. The Chinese necklace of pearls, or the string of pearls, Chinese string of pearls, is basically a series of listening posts and naval bases in the Indian Ocean region to check India and ensure that its maritime trade routes are not compromised. China has done this using the Belt and Road Initiative and the naval equivalent called the Maritime Silk Route. So what it has done is it's developed a listening post in Chittagong. It has currently 3 projects, BRI projects in Myanmar. In fact, the Myanmar post-COVID bill includes funding for the free trade zone, a port, and a new Yangon capital city. It has developed the Hambantota port, and the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka is basically a very stark example of Chinese debt diplomacy. So what China does is it's not spending out of its own pocket. It goes to the World Bank. It borrows money at a rate of 1 to 3%, and then goes to Sri Lanka and says, look, Sri Lanka, we want to build you a port. We'll build you a world-class port at Hambantota. We promise you that at the end, in the first year alone, you will see 10,000 ships. And you will make so much money in the ships, with the ships berthing, with these 10,000 ships berthing, that you will be able to pay us back the loan. And the interest rate that they charged on the loan was 8%. Or somewhere between 6 and 8%. So they borrowed money from the World Bank at 3%, and they're charging interest rates at anywhere between 6 to 8%. With such high interest rates, Sri Lanka was not able to pay back the loan. So when the port was constructed, the Chinese said, you'll see 10,000 ships in the first year. In the first year, Sri Lanka saw 37 ships. That's 37. As a consequence of that, Sri Lanka could not, pay back the loan. And China negotiated a 99-year lease to manage the port. And obviously, this port has now become a listening post. We see submarines in Hambantota, we see naval ships in Hambantota, and China is now using this as a naval base. What it's also done is that it's purchased, there is an atoll from the Maldives when there was a diplomatic sort of breakdown between India and the Maldives. And it's used, and it's actually creating a naval base in the Maldives to sort of house its listening posts and its naval ships and submarines, right? And then, of course, you have Gaudar, which China has been developing very aggressively, this deep water port. And over the last few months, China is actually now converting the port into a full-fledged military base. Satellite pictures show that it's been installing guard stations, guard towers, barracks, perimeter fences, and sort of it's converting it into a fully fledged joint Chinese-Pakistani military base, which will oversee its supply lines coming in from the Straits of Hormuz, as I discussed in the earlier section. So China has created this string of listening posts and naval bases to be able to actually box India in, keep her in check, and to ensure a smooth supply of its trade and maritime traffic. And it's been able to do so using its checkbook diplomacy. And when countries have not been able to pay back the loan, it's negotiated these saying, let us either build a naval base or let us manage this port that we have now built for you. And this is a repeated pattern that China has employed to sort of ensure its strategic dominance. Now, obviously, India has not been caught napping. India has also worked very hard to counter the sort of Chinese buildup in the Indian Ocean region. So I introduced to you the Indian necklace of diamonds. Now, again, bear in mind, these are not naval bases per se, but these are, logistics contracts that have been signed. Like what India has done is, it has signed logistic pacts with naval bases in Vietnam. It has signed logistic pacts with the Sabang port in Indonesia. It has signed logistic pacts with the Changi port in Singapore. It has signed a logistic pact with Australia to be able to base its naval assets in these ports, with vice versa, reciprocal rights from these countries. It has the ability to base its naval assets in these ports, to refuel its naval assets in these ports, and rearm these naval assets in these ports. So without actually necessarily having to build a military base, it has the ability to go and base its warships there. India is already set up a listening post or a naval listening station in Mauritius. It is trying to build an actual naval base in Assumption in Seychelles, but that's again going through a lot of protests by the local islanders. It is trying to build a naval station in Aglega and Mauritius, which is again going through a lot of protests. So whether they will actually build a naval base in Aglega and Assumption is a question mark, but they certainly do have a naval presence in the Seychelles and Mauritius. And Indian naval ships routinely dock in Mauritius and Seychelles on goodwill visits. So maybe if they don't build the base, they are still able to dock and conduct the maritime surveillance. In fact, a lot of India's Dornier or overflight crafts take off from these naval stations. India also has entered into an agreement with the US to use Diego Garcia, which is the Chagos Islands, which the UK ceded to the US in the 60s away from Mauritius. And the only reason that India is not using Diego Garcia is because traditionally it's always been afraid to open up the Andaman and Nicobar Island bases to US ships. Now, obviously, after this Eastern Ladakh standoff, all of that will possibly change. India is aggressively now trying to develop the bases in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and it's hinted at being open to allowing the US ships to come and sort of berth in Andaman and Nicobar in return for berthing at Diego Garcia. India has also signed logistic pacts with the Duqm port in Oman, and India has built and currently operates the Chabar port in Iran. Now, I want to talk about Iran for a minute because there's been a lot of news, articles in the news about India being kicked out of the Chabar-Zahedan link or the railway link. They're saying that the Indian Railways said that they would build this link between Chabar and Zahedan. They took too long because of the US sanctions. They were not able to find vendors to deliver the raw materials. And the Iranians said now that we are doing it on our own. And Iran and China are in the process of finalizing a $400 billion infrastructure trade deal for China to come and invest heavily in Iran. Now, why is China doing this in Iran? Is because Iran has been sanctioned very heavily by the US government. The US has walked out of the JCPOA or the nuclear deal. It has now gone back to sanctioning Iran. And obviously, Iran feels slighted. And as it sees India cozying up more and more to the US, it feels that India now cozying up to the US does not have the ability to stand up to the US for Iran's interests. So it said, look, you're cozying up to the US too much. We need to maintain our sort of geostrategic independence. We fear that because you're cozying up to the US, the projects that you've signed with us will be delayed. China does not care about the US. It does not care about US sanctions. China has the ability to supply the vendors and the raw materials for these infrastructure projects. And as a result and as a consequence of that, the Chinese government has the ability to purchase very cheap oil from Iran, thereby giving Iran a source of income. Because bear in mind that India was purchasing oil from Iran, and we actually had a rupee to ruble swap deal where we were buying Iranian oil and paying in rupees. And Iran was using these rupees to buy Indian goods. But with the US sanctions in, India's virtually stopped buying from Iran and is now buying from Saudi Arabia. So, Iran has lost India as a customer. So it feels that, India is moving too much into the US alignment of things and has now moved towards China. So obviously, in this geopolitical great game, there are going to be wins, there are going to be losses. India can no longer afford to be in a truly non-aligned camp. It has to move aggressively. It has to work with allies. And in working with allies, it sometimes has to accommodate what the allies want as well. So we now have to move into a sort of shared approach, a sort of teamwork approach, etc., etc. Now, concluding, why is China doing this? Like, why now? What is it about the Chinese government that is so assertive over the last few years? See, you have to understand that Xi Jinping is now president for life. Term limits do not apply to him. Xi Jinping sees himself as the next Mao Zedong. He sees himself as the next Deng Xiaoping. He doesn't see himself as an ordinary Chinese president. He sees himself in the league of the fathers of China. He's like like Mao was the founder of modern China. Deng is the father of modern, economically strong China. He wants to be seen as the next father of China. And obviously, he has a legacy to look after. And you don't want COVID-19 to be on your legacy. You don't want the defining moment of your legacy to be the novel coronavirus. Initially, prior to the COVID, Xi was betting big on the Belt and Road Initiative. He was betting big on the Maritime Silk Route. He said, I will build infrastructure. I will build rails and roads into Europe. I will build it into Asia. China will trade with the world. And that was to be his legacy. Now, obviously, with the coronavirus, pandemic and a lot of anger turning towards China, he said, look, if I'm not able to achieve my goals diplomatically, I will achieve them by force. I will achieve them through military intimidation. I will achieve them through bullying. And again, there are two different schools of thought here. There is one school of thought that says that Xi is now making these decisions alone. He is not consulting his closest advisors. He's become increasingly more belligerent and bellicose and isolated and making these sort of very rough decisions by himself. And there's another school of thought that says, no, he has in fact chosen to surround himself with more aggressive wolf warrior diplomats who are now pushing for a more assertive, more aggressive China, and using this opportunity to bring China as a new global power in an increasingly multipolar world. It's a typical Thucydidean trap, right? When a rising power like China challenges the supremacy of an existing power like the US, conflict is inevitable. Now, the Chinese strategy of doing this is what I like to call Waikui. Now, Waikui is a game called Go in English. Now, understand that in India we play chess. And how does chess work? Chess works with chess pieces on a board, right? And what is the goal of chess? To move my pieces to the other side and to checkmate the king. So, okay, so chess pieces are basically, you have your rooks, your knights and pawns. You have equal number of pieces on either side, and your goal is to sort of move your pawns on your pieces to the other side. So you define victory as an out and out check. The Chinese play a game of Waikui or Go. The goal of Go is actually placing marbles on a tile or on a board, white marbles and black marbles. And each player tries to use his marbles to surround the other player's marbles. And the winner of the game is the player who has surrounded more of his opponent's marbles than his marbles have been surrounded. So the Chinese strategy is not active head-on-head conflict, but it is strategic encirclement, it is strategic entanglement, and it is basically tying up your enemies by creating alliances with their enemies. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and which is what China has done with Pakistan in Ladakh. It is what it is doing in the South China Sea. It is what it's doing in the East China Sea. It is what it's doing in Hong Kong and Taiwan. It is using strategic encirclement. It is using information warfare. It is using asymmetric warfare to intimidate the enemy, bully the enemy, and to surround and encircle the enemy and achieving its geostrategic goals without firing a shot. So this in a nutshell is China's, what do you say, ambitions. The gloves are off. China has now presented its true belligerent face to the world, and now the world will have to react accordingly. On that note, I end my conversation. I end my talk. I thank you very much, and I will now open the floor for questions.
Shobha, are you there? Shobha? Okay, I won't waste time, Tanvir. There is a question from our member, Asha Murthy. She wants to know, why can't India push China back in Pangong So like we pushed Pakistan back in Kargil?
Okay, very good question. See, in Kargil, understand that the Pakistani government had disavowed the intruders as, what do you say, terrorists or as local freedom fighters. They did not recognize the intruders in Kargil as Pakistani army soldiers. Because they did not recognize the intruders as Pakistani army soldiers, they could not support these intruders with heavy artillery. They could not support these intruders with tanks. They could not support these intruders with helicopters. They could not support these intruders in any way because they had completely disavowed them, which is why India was able to use its entire military might, air force, including its artillery, to be able to flush out the intruders. In the Pangong Tso area, the Chinese military is not disavowing its actions. The Chinese government is saying, hey, this is not some rogue general doing this. This has been approved by the Chinese government at the highest level. So you have the actual Chinese military in the Pangong Tso. And the fear is, if you actually try to dislodge them in the Pangong Tso, you might bring the entire brunt of the Chinese military down in the Gogra, in the hot springs. You could bring the brunt of the Chinese military down in Sikkim. You can bring the brunt of the Chinese military down in Arunachal Pradesh, which means there's a huge scope towards escalation. Yes, the screen is blank. So that is why we cannot oust them from the Pangong Tso as easily as we were able to do it in Kargil. Had the Pakistani army with Pakistani soldiers officially occupied the heights with their tanks and their bombs and their guns, it would have been a full-scale war. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Tanvir. The next question comes from our member, Prabha Chakravarti, and she wants to know, are you saying the Indian government is not aware of the strategic importance of Daulat Beg Oldie? Are they deliberately downplaying the whole thing?
They are in fact very much aware of the importance of the Daulat Beg Oldie. Let me be very clear, ladies and gentlemen. The Indian armed forces and the Indian government are not plucking flowers. The Indian army, and I've spoken to several former military commanders who have served in the area, they have war. Again, bear in mind, there was an intrusion into the Depsang Bulge in 2013. So this is not the first time that this has happened. They've done this before. So obviously the geostrategic importance of the Daulat Beg Oldie is very clearly understood, right? And the Indian army routinely, year after year, war games exercises, war game scenarios where the Chinese actually intrude and make a push towards Daulat Beg Oldie, and they actually make these sort of war plans as to how to oust them from this. So the Indian military is well aware. In fact, when the Eastern Ladakh standoff began, the Indian military started deploying across the entire line of control. That's not just the Depsang Bulge and not just the Daulat Beg Oldie, but in Sikkim and in Arunachal Pradesh as well. So clearly they are aware. Why it's not being reported is because the Chinese understand how our media think. They understand that if they kill 20 of our soldiers in Galwan, and they lay a claim on Galwan, all we will be doing is screaming about the Galwan. They understand that if they refuse to move from Pangong Tso, or they know that we will be screaming about the Pangong Tso. They rely on our media's need for sensationalism, on the media's need for clickbait journalism, not to talk about the real issues. Because at the end of the day, it's more appealing to talk about a Galwan clash and 20 soldiers dying. It's more newsworthy to talk about the Pangong Tso than it is to talk about the Daulat Beg oldie. It just doesn't make good news. So the Indian government is aware. The military is certainly very, very aware. They have war gamed this scenario out countless times. It's just that the media is choosing sensationalism over the actual hard ground realities.
Thank you. Tanvir, there is a question from Mr. Kanan. He wants to know which is a more dangerous virus, China or Corona?
Corona, we will have a cure hopefully one day. The Oxford has come up with a Covishield. The Chinese virus, on the other hand, is going to be around for a long, long, long time. Unless you learn to assert yourself, unless you learn not to be bullied, then it is something that you will have to deal with. And it's very important because many times India has gone to China and said, look, let's exchange maps and let's demarcate the line of actual control. Let's draw the line. I understand that we will always want Aksai Chin and you will always want Tibet. We understand that we may never be able to get Aksai Chin back and you may never be able to get Arunachal back, but at least let's demarcate the line of actual control so there's no, what do you say, misunderstandings that we're having now. And China refuses to demarcate the border because at any given point they know that they can push troops into the line of control to what they call their claim line and intimidate and needle India. So that China is using this undemarcated border. China is refusing to demarcate this border simply so it can bully and intimidate. So this China virus is going to be there for a long time.
Yeah, I think Kamla's question is why can't Modi with his access to Z after 15 meetings resolve this?
It'll come from a place of weakness. Look, ultimately, if you are going to, if you're going to Xi now, it look like you're coming from a place of desperation. You don't want to come from a place of desperation. You want to come from a place of strength. You want to come from a place where your army and your navy and your air forces, look, in case talks break down, we are ready to defend the line. We are ready to hold the line and we are ready to push them back. So it's obviously not diplomatically prudent for Modi to pick up the phone and speak to Xi, as it come from a place of desperation. You've got the mechanisms in place to have it. In fact, even with Doklam, it was Ajit Doval that had went and spoke to Yang Yi to disengage. It was not Modi and Xi speaking. So it doesn't have to be Modi and Xi speaking. It can be the two NSAs actually speaking and bringing an end to this. So there are these existing mechanisms in place. The moment you bring two heads of state in it, you come. You will have to start. It could break the relationship. Modi might be forced to make concessions. So it's better really that Modi and Xi don't talk and leave this sort of leave Jay Shankar and the National Security Advisor to actually do the talking.
I know. I think we are done.
Yeah, sure. Shobha, I'm handing this over to you now. Please take it up forward.
Yeah.
Question, Shobha, I had typed it up.
Yeah. Please ask Kamla.
Okay. You had spoken as oil being one of the main reasons for the India-China problem, so they have a direct access to oil. Will oil itself continue to be such an important source of energy with us finding different sources of natural energy? So will the China plan really work out?
It's not just oil, Ms. Kamla. It's not just oil. It's oil, it's natural gas resources, it's your trade, it's your goods, it's your actual durable goods, perishable goods, it's energy. It's not simply a question of oil. And right now, understand that China, like the rest of the world, is heavily dependent on oil and natural gas. Right, the move towards a carbon neutral green future is still about 30, 40, 50, 60 years away, which means that for the next 3-4 decades, you still need a viable and steady supply of oil and fossil fuels and natural gas. So maybe 50, 60 years from now, you may want to use your sea-going routes only for trading of goods. But for the next 3-4 decades, you're still going to be very heavily dependent on oil and other sort of fossil fuels and resources. So it is oil, yes, but it's also a lot of other things.
We'll just take this last question and then we'll close this session. There's a question by Veena Agrawal which says, why opposition says that India has surrendered the territory to China?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, statutory warning. Do not read the wire. Do not listen to a word that Ajay Shukla is saying. Do not listen to a word Colonel Panang is saying. Do not listen to a word, especially do not listen to a word that Rahul Gandhi is saying. Right? Please, I beseech you. If there is one thing I can beseech you, do not listen. And I will tell you why. You are coming from and I understand where this question is coming from. See, as part of the Galman Valley disengagement, both sides have agreed to withdraw to a 2-kilometer buffer. Now, this withdrawal is a temporary withdrawal for the next 30 days while they work out future modalities of patrolling. So what that means is what China did, they said, look, we will withdraw, we will maintain a buffer of 2 kilometers on either side for 30 days, and we will change the modalities of patrolling. So instead of the Chinese army and the Indian army patrolling, maybe we will have the Indo-Tibetan border police and the Chinese military and the Chinese police or the Chinese militarized police patrol it to avoid further incidents. This buffer zone has in no way become permanent. What Rahul Gandhi is saying, going off what Ajay Shukla is saying, is that because the Indian buffer zone starts not from petrol point 14, but from the y-axis of the Galwan River, it gives China effectively 4 kilometers of new territory and control over petrol point 14. That is absolutely not the case. We have lost 20 soldiers in defending petrol point 14. A man like Lieutenant General Harinder Singh, who is the corps commander of the Leh Corps, a man who has the power of fire and death in that region, a man who has got 50,000 men in working under his command, is not going to say, yes, we accept this new alignment, please keep petrol point 14. As part of the disengagement, where they're not going to go eyeball to eyeball with each other, they have said, while we are disengaging, we will not patrol, we will have a buffer zone on either side. Obviously, this disengagement is going to be a long process. Understand that in 1986, when the Chinese government, the Chinese military intruded into the Samdrong-Chu Valley, that disengagement took 6 to 7 years. This is not something that's going to wrap up in 73 days. This is going to go on to 2021. And obviously, if the Chinese refuse to disengage, we may have to look at a localized war and try to get them some way after building significant diplomatic and military pressure. So obviously, that takes time. One of the reasons why we lost the war is in 1962, there was a huge amount of pressure in Nehru to attack China. And the Indian military said, look, or the commanders on the ground said, look, we haven't built up. It is now October. Winter is coming. We will be in a position to dislodge them only in April of 1963. Now, General Kaul, who was appointed the commander of this mythical 4 corps, went and told Nehru, yeah, dislodge them, no problem, my commanders will do it. Against better judgment, Kaul actually ordered the commanders to attack and dislodge the Chinese from the Tagla Ridge. And as a consequence of that, we entered a war we were not prepared to fight. Now, what Rahul Gandhi is trying to do is to try and make Modi commit the same mistake that the opposition got Nehru to do in 1962. Modi is smart. And I'm not saying this to defend him, but I'm saying that Modi is doing this the right thing. He's waiting to build up his forces to know that sufficiently he can dislodge them and hold the line. So it's not that we have ceded territory. There are 40,000 troops on either side that has been built up. The army is now acquiring cold weather tents, cold weather clothing, rations, winter freeze, kerosene, high weaponry to keep the standoff going well into the winter months. No territory is being ceded. We are in eyeball to eyeball. Please do not believe what the opposition is saying.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Tanvir. That was very informative, very absorbing. And with all your maps and illustrations, it was very easy to understand and follow, and gives us a kind of level of comfort that we are not going to be taken in so easily this time around, if it comes to that.
Yes.
And I think Rotarian President Chitle joined us. I don't know whether he's still around. President of Rotary Club of Madras. I thank him for joining. And thank Anuradha for connecting us to Mr. Tanvir. It was really an interesting and absorbing session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanvir.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.